Peak fraud 4th July data. Playing games with cases and deaths. The overwhelming majority of nations' charts show legitimate curves, normal, crashing to nothing, or still heading for peak. 3 countries, easy to guess who, are anything but normal. Note to censors, we use only government data. If you have a problem with the results, speak to the government. We've used our growth analysis charts to look at an issue we've long highlighted, the way the virus detects peak and goes sideways in the UK, Sweden and the US. The virus isn't supposed to be able to detect peak. Politicians can. We've looked at 212 countries' charts and broken them down into legitimate 116, non-peak 54, sparse 18, fat 18, attention 3 and dodgy 3. Legitimate looks like this. Normal, go figure, with cases in particular and deaths crashing down off peak. Maybe there's a lingering tail at bottom, but at low levels, so not an issue. Normal, legitimate, 116 countries. Non-peak looks like this. The autofit does a surprisingly good job showing the ascent to be normal, but there's no lingering after peak as they haven't hit peak yet, 54 countries. Sparse looks like this. They're a special case of legitimate in that they've escaped the virus almost entirely. Lucky them. 18 countries. Fat looks like this. They don't linger at peak, but they take their time coming down versus the speed with which they went up. A lot of familiar names here, worthy of a quick peek and finger wag, keeping an eye on you. 18 countries. Attention looks like this. Worse than fat, the distortion starts early, but the charts are messy, so foul play or bad luck or bad management. Deserving of attention, 3 countries. Leaving 3 countries whose charts go blatantly sideways at peak. Remarkable behaviour from a virus that doesn't report cases and deaths, doesn't have CNN, and doesn't track peak. Politicians do all of those, and there's no surprise that we're talking 2 of the power fraud agenda centres, and Sweden, which dared to not lock down and must be seen to fail, but they haven't quite managed it yet. The UK we highlighted early on, as it hit peak on April the 11th formally, but then went sideways, deciding to ignore normal and naturally increasing total cases and deaths as a result. All those announcements that lockdown is working and we're flattening the curve when it wasn't, the trajectory of the virus just continued entirely normally, as we showed and as you can see here, from start to peak. And when the trajectory did alter away from normal, it was not to reduce but to increase, refusing to go down as 116 other legitimate peaked countries did, but lingering, more cases, more deaths. Surprise? Not anymore. For the US, the recent mania for testing has totally invalidated any legitimate meaning for cases. At least you had to be sick before to be a case. Now you're a non-sick case. We need to tell you that you're sick. Priceless. Which means we need to set the cases normal to the original peak to get a proper look at this. The deaths chart, however, is already priceless. Did they use a ruler? It's that damn straight. The chart's a little more advanced now, but here's the manual fit to an 11th April peak, in line with the UK peak of the same date, and you can see via the dark blue curve it's a good fit and a very standard growth decline, 0.989. The significance of 0.989 is that it and 0.986 were 2 popular growth decline rates that showed that pre-lockdown the virus was already normal and declining as expected in a very reasonable range, 0.986 to 0.989. We go into this in more detail in our growth analysis charts. They're hardcore, but they show that across a whole range of countries, the virus was behaving normally and consistently. It is in fact the first time that we've been able to show mathematically that finally we're looking at a real virus and when it's acting normally. We knew it, we described it, but now we can prove it right to the very core of the viral behavior. For our purposes here though, let's put this full screen so you can see that remarkable virus deciding it hadn't had enough cases or deaths yet. And in case, so to speak, it's confusing seeing cases and growth on the same chart, here's the top left chart with only the growth analysis, declining to peak as normal, then going sideways. So yes, hardly a surprise that find that 2 of the 3 power centres, fraud centres, agenda centres, call them what you will, should have a virus reported to be acting very strangely indeed. Perhaps the surprise is that the EU, Belgium, didn't follow suit. Belgium is the hardest hit nation on the planet by normalised population, but it kept its chart tidy and normal, as did Germany, both shown here. France and Italy were a bit fat, as here, but no, European countries managed to top the league of worst hit nations with perfectly legitimate seeming curves. Only the US and UK showed utter disregard for normal or legitimate and pushed it to the absurd. Carelessness or arrogance, maybe they were right, because no one of course has noticed. That leaves Sweden, and while their chart looks equally dodgy, I suggest it's for a different reason. They haven't been pushing the agenda. On the contrary, they've been flouting it and choosing not to lock down. Indeed, in the early days, they were doing brilliantly, easily as well as the other prime agenda countries, better even. As with the US, the recent mania for testing has utterly corrupted the previously reasonable cases definition. At least you had to start out as sick to become a case. So we're going to have to set the autofit to an earlier peak, or mean. I'm sure the agendaholics and apologists would love Sweden to make the number 1 slot in deaths to show how foolish they were not to lock down. But deaths are petering out and they're only in the number 5 slot in nations, number 6 including New York City, and I really don't see them catching those two. However, with the fraudulent absurdity that is cases testing you're not sick, but you are really, you just didn't know it, maybe they'll manage it and the fingers will be pointed. It is tragic that the media can be so complicit, utterly refusing to notice something unless it supports the agenda. I'm almost surprised they let the token rebellion survive, the occasional post by Peter Hitchens, for example. Maybe they know that without objection it looks like propaganda, but never enough, never a threat, and never the truly damning material. Gee, like ours maybe. Sad. And while we're here, the current world rankings. We've now integrated New York City. It felt bizarre knowing that Agenda HQ was out there, but not being a nation, it's not singled out by World Health Organization. Naturally, the US is represented around number 7 in nations, but I'm sure the US hates not being in the number 1 slot, so including New York City achieves that. First is number 1 New York City, USA, second is Belgium, EU HQ, and the third is the UK. The richest, most powerful, best healthcare and worst hit in the world. And no one notices. They're hit 354 times, 134 times, and 105 times worse than the Far East, and no one notices. And God forbid an agendaholic sees these stats, because they'll manage to distort reality to the point of denying gravity if that's what it takes not to see the obvious. But hey, for the full picture, go check out our chart updates, and what the heck, without explanation, see our chart and stats essentials video if not familiar. Let's show New York City and the big three, Belgium, UK and USA, but world rankings full screen first. So there you go. I wanted to see if any other countries were playing silly buggers with their cases, deaths and their people, but even the EU likes to do things properly. Massively inflated figures versus the Far East, but the charts look proper. In the entire world, there are a few cautions, fat, but only 3 stand out as absurd, and hardly a surprise to find that they could be agenda centres US and UK, and war of terror partners of course, and the country that must be punished, Sweden. I'm Andrew Mather, a 60-year-old Brit, mathematician, financier, technologist, husband, biker, pilot, healer, whatever. Feel free to get in touch, Andrew at peerlessreads.com or andrew@amather.com. Either should get to me.